Okay, I think we are going to start now. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to be talking about how to organize, present, and share data in your manuscript. And this is the team we have today. I'm going to start with Jessica. Jessica Offenberger is a publishing editor on the Sage Journal's editorial team. She works closely with editors and societies to help navigate the publishing process and develop key strategies. Next, we have Erin E. Barton, who is an associate professor in the Department of Special Education at Vanderbilt University. She is a former special education teacher and currently teaches graduate-level courses on evidence-based assessment and intervention practices for young children with disabilities and single-case research design. She's a board-certified behavior analyst and directs research projects related to evidence-based practices for young children, policies and practices that support high-quality inclusion and effective professional development systems. Dr. Barton is an active scholar with over 100 publications in major journals, multiple chapters and 4 textbooks related to evidence-based practices. Dr. Barton serves on several editorial boards and is the editor-in-chief of topics in early childhood special education and an associate editor for the Journal of Early Intervention and Remedial and Special Education. Next, we have Sean Scarisbrick, who is a marketing manager on the author marketing team at Sage. He is based out of New York and has over 5 years of experience in the publishing industry. He's passionate about helping authors, especially those in the early stages of their career, to navigate the publishing process. And finally, there's me, Maria Tissot. I am a marketing manager in the author marketing team at Sage, and my work is focused on helping early career researchers get published. So you can send us your questions throughout the webinar today using the Q&A box on your screen. It should be at the bottom of your screen. And we will have around 15 minutes at the end of the session to answer questions. So if we don't have time to answer all the questions, we will follow up with you after the webinar, so don't worry. And I will now pass it on to Sean.
Thank you. So the chart you see here illustrates a timeline of the typical author journey, moving from the early stages of securing funding and conducting research all the way through peer review and publication. Today, we are covering how to organize, present, and share your data. We encourage you to go back and watch recordings of other topics we've covered in this series, including how to write and format a manuscript and how to navigate the peer review process. We just wanted to remind you that there are 2 main business models in the journal's publishing business: subscription and open access, also called OA. In all cases, authors write, submit content to us. If accepted, the article is published and then made available to readers. In the subscription model, the readers pay us for access. The content is kept behind a paywall, so to access it, a reader must have a subscription, either through their institution or as an individual. There is no cost to publish in a subscription journal. With an open access model, authors pay us to publish. Frequently, authors will have financial support from their institution or funders. Authors pay an article processing charge, or APC. The content is then freely available online for anyone to read. No logins or subscriptions are required. There is also what we call the hybrid model, where you can publish open access in a subscription journal. This is optional and has a cost, also in the instance where authors pay an APC. You may be eligible for discounts or waivers through your institution if you're from a Research for Life country, and there are also many journals that have no cost to publish in. Data is the cornerstone of your research, and it helps inform your research conclusions. Including data in your research paper shows the reader how you reached your conclusions. It allows for transparency, and it builds confidence and trust in your research. Research data is required to verify the results of research reported in published journal articles. So why is open research data sharing important? Open data sharing enables others to reuse results and build on previous findings, helps improve efficiencies of the research process, and it helps to drive a faster pace of research and discovery. Open data also supports transparency and the validation of research, ensuring that Ensuring that the data behind published research can be reproduced leads to a fairer and more robust and accountable research landscape. The ease of access and ease of discovery means that there are more opportunities to find and extract knowledge. Depositing data in a repository with a permanent identifier, such as a DOI, allows authors to cite the data set, and it allows authors to gain appropriate credit for their work and ensure the long-term preservation of data. Pre-registration and registered reports are something that some journals require. Journals who do pre-registration and registered reports require that you submit data research ahead of time. This is most common with experimental studies, but it certainly happens with other types of analyses. With pre-registration, you are also asked to submit your research design ahead of conducting the study, including noting your hypotheses, methodologies, and analyses you will use in your research. Registered reports are very similar to pre-registration, except you take it one step further, and your research design is put through peer review. Thus, you're getting feedback on your research design by your reviewers. Pre-registration and registered reports both encourage transparency in research design and data collection. They both prioritize solid research design over results, and thus put less emphasis on finding statistical significance. Registered reports also allow peer reviewers to provide feedback when it matters most before the research is conducted. And for some journals, but not all, if you get your research design approved, it ensures that a publication will come out of that research. So in general, pre-registration and registered reports are most common with quantitative work, more common than qualitative work. Some SAGE journals, such as Advances in Methods and Practices in Psychological Science, do pre-registration. Others, like Gifted Child Quarterly, the Quarterly Journal of Experimental Psychology, and the European Journal of Personality, do registered reports.
Thank you, Sean. That's a really great place to start on data and some of the foundations. So continuing this conversation, let's first take a step back and take a look at the types of data. So you have primary data. This is data gathered by you, the researcher. Then we have secondary data. This is often data that's used by the researcher, but collected by someone else. So then you have the research data itself. What is this data that we're talking about? This is data that's created, collected, or observed in order to produce new research results and to support scientific evidence. The qualitative data, you'll hear this a lot. You've heard this in other webinars and other presentations, but the qualitative data is presented with words, descriptions, and/or symbols, whereas the quantitative data is counted or measured and is expressed as that numerical value. So some examples of qualitative data include interviews, transcripts, case studies, photos, videos, and so forth. Quantitative data, these data can be used for statistical manipulation to create tables and graphs. For example, if a study is looking at the relationship between something like weight, age, and health outcomes, and weight and age would be those quantitative data because it's represented in that numerical format. So with all of that, you have the research records. So these are administrative materials and supporting documentation like grant applications or research reports and publications. So it's worth noting here that when it is appropriate to use primary versus secondary data. For example, if you are trying to understand factors that include a historical event and thus are doing process tracing, using secondary data will be important here. Because you will likely not have access to the firsthand accounts of those historical events. So it's important to identify when you will need to conduct your own research yourself, that primary data, versus looking at data collected by someone else, something historical, and then maybe building upon that. So you might need to blend the two together. looking at the data and that path that it follows. So the first step here is the actual generation of data, whether that's primary data, secondary data, what have you. So the first step of this life cycle is the creation of data. Then you're going to go through and actually collect it, process it, analyze the data. And once the data have been cleaned and only those high quality results remain, that's when you're going to go into that analysis phase. We'll talk a little bit about the different visualization steps and how to interpret that, as well as the storage and management of that data today. So looking at data management and storage, it's important to think about how you will store the data, how you will back up the data, how often, and how you will protect the privacy of the data that you are collecting, as well as the accessibility of that. So where will the data be stored in the system? I know we're kind of jumping around in this lifestyle process, but it's important to think about all of these questions up front. So where will the data be stored in the system in the short term, in the long term? Where and how will you back this up? How will you make that data accessible when it's needed? Especially data that contains personal information, such as medical research data, must have stringent privacy controls applied to it. Privacy may be a less critical issue when storing data on animal populations in a natural history research project, though. So even if you're collecting data on a smaller scale for your research project, it's still important to consider the future of your data. Especially for qualitative work, it can be incredibly important to keep things anonymized to make sure that participant information cannot be shared, that shouldn't be shared. So following those institutional review board guidelines are super important here. I know some people have asked in the past, what if you don't have an institutional review board? Your organization might have something outlined. You can also, we're going to post a variety of resources here, like the Equator Network, Prisma. These are great guidelines to follow on what type of things should be considered. So related to that, you have the metadata. The metadata includes a description of what the data set contains and when and how it was collected. Metadata makes that data searchable and gives enough information to reuse your data and replicate your analysis. So what Sean was talking about, the transparency, the ability to reproduce your results, this is crucial. So metadata will help you fill in the gaps. You can use spreadsheets, templates, electronic forms, or metadata creation tools to help with this. Taking a step back, we're covering a lot of questions, big picture questions. So remember, with you and your co-authors, remember to cover responsibilities for data management when you agree on your rules. For example, who on your team, which of these co-authors is responsible for storing, backing up the data, or checking the data integrity? So make sure all of this is outlined as you're developing your research hypothesis and starting to do that data collection. I have FAIR outlined here for a reason. These are principles you will want to think about with data. So FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So to ensure researchers share data in a fair and honest way, many research organizations have signed up to support these FAIR principles. So by applying these FAIR principles to your data, you will make it more valuable, easier to find, and more likely that will be used by the research community. Findable means the data are described with that rich metadata that we're talking about, that the data is defined with a globally unique and persistent identifier, and the data and metadata are registered and indexed in a searchable resource. For instance, one example of this would be the European Bioinformatics Institute's search, the EBI search. Accessible. So there may be circumstances in which it's not appropriate for all data to be openly available. However, they should be made available potentially under restrictions. So this can be achieved by making data fully accessible to only a subset of people who meet certain conditions, maybe after ethical approval, maybe only making a subset of data available, maybe making that data only available after a certain date, or maybe making the data accessible upon request. So thinking about the data that you're collecting and how, when, where, and who should be accessing that. We do really want to try to encourage these results to be replicated in every way possible. So related to that, it's also important to deposit data in a data repository that which supports open access or free access whenever possible, meaning fully accessible to everyone. You'll want to include any dedicated methods needed to access the data, maybe ethical approval with the data description, and you'll always want to ensure associated metadata are always openly accessible, even if there are restrictions on the data itself, like we talked about. Maybe there's an embargo date. So the goal of FAIR is to optimize the reuse of data. So it's important to know how the data is licensed to permit the widest reuse possible and how long it is intended to remain reusable. You'll want to make sure you have a data management plan, or DMP. So this is a term that you'll hear throughout your research. A DMP is a formal document that describes how your data will be looked at through the complete data life cycle. So during that whole research process and beyond. So when you're applying for funding for research, a successful grant funding application requires a detailed DMP. We also have a grant funding webinar coming up in June, which you'll want to tune into. Writing a DMP can definitely be overwhelming, as can working on your manuscript. So if you're at the stage where you will be applying for a research grant, you'll find that there is support available from your institution's pre-award team. Maybe a senior member of your group might be able to help if you are a student or a postdoc. So I encourage you to connect with your colleagues in your institution or organization. That will be a great resource for you. So presenting data, so this is key. We've talked a little bit about how to store it, how to share it, but that presentation of data is important as well for other researchers when they're looking at your work and trying to replicate it or use it to build new studies. So with quantitative studies, you'll want to make sure that you're presenting your results in an informative way. Demographic data that describe the sample are usually presented first, and you'll want to remind the reader of the research question being addressed or the hypothesis being tested. That's coming in the introduction, but then as you're presenting this data in the methods section and beyond, you'll want to be reminding people of this hypothesis or research question. You'll state which differences are significant, highlighting the important trends and either differences or comparisons, and then going through and indicating whether the hypothesis is supported or not. We have an entire webinar on how to actually write and structure your manuscript. So that's a great recording to go back and look at. That will help with that overall presentation, what information should be included where. But that data will be sprinkled throughout your manuscript and in particular in the methods section. So here, this is one example. This is a clear presentation of descriptive statistics. This is a clear and easy way to understand the way to present the data that isn't complicated. It's not as complicated as a regression analysis, which you see here. So this is a little bit more complex, but this visualization is very clear, the changes over time across multiple different contexts. These recordings will be circulated. You'll have this slide deck for your review, so you can go back and study these examples of great ways to illustrate your data. So be rest assured that you'll have that available to you in the future. Another tool I wanted to highlight here, another great way to present data, heat maps. So heat maps are a great way to present data when one is interested in the geographic spread of instruments or variables. So this is a great example here. It's much easier to see that spread in a heat map rather than just words. Of course, you can accompany it with text or a legend or a descriptor, but this is a really great way to illustrate those that geographic spread. Here, we have a great example of an equation. If you're working on putting out equations, you'll want to make sure to outline those variables and really give examples of those variables. So you can take a look at a great example outlined here. So this is another fantastic table that shows how to present various data that you may have collected. For those interested in stat significance, this is a great example. And then in the footnote, which I'll include the link to the article that you can browse. But in the footnote, you can see what the asterisk means. So it's very clearly outlined. We talked about that in one of our previous webinars, that it's you want to make sure that your descriptions, your legends, your footnotes are all very clear on what the user is looking at. You should be able to take a look at a table within an article, and it should be able to stand alone on its own so that you can take a look and actually understand what this data means without having to read the entire article. Of course, you'll want to read the entire article for context and understand the results, the discussion, the conclusion, to really put that into context. But a table, a heat map, an equation should be able to stand on its own so you can understand what you're looking at. This is a nice display of predictive values with confidence intervals. So another great example here for your review. Experimental studies, Sean talked a little bit about this with pre-registration, registered reports. When you present your data for experimental studies, these results are almost always presented separately from the discussion. A lot of this is best illustrated in tables and figures, so this can cross both quantitative and qualitative studies. You'll want to use text to introduce those tables and figures and guide the reader through those key results. Again, you're going to point out the differences and relationships and provide information as necessary. Definitely include negative results or null results, and then explain those findings in the discussion section. Especially with experimental studies, this is really crucial. Of course, those negative null findings are important to disclose in quantitative and qualitative studies as well, but this is especially key for experimental studies. For qualitative studies, this is more where the presentation and discussion of qualitative data are often combined and usually expressed in words. So you want to make sure that it's well structured to easily guide the reader, and you'll want to use clear headings and subheadings. It's difficult to present qualitative data neatly in tables and figures. So this is why it's often expressed in words. This will in turn result in a large quantity of written material through which you will guide your reader, and therefore structuring that analysis is very important. Try to make sure your sections and subheadings reflect the themes that have emerged from your analysis of the data, and make sure your reader understands how these themes evolved. So these headings and subheadings, as well as directions to the reader, are forms of signposting that you can make sure these chapters, your chapters within your manuscript, are really easy to navigate. There are some, this also might influence the journal to which you submit. Many journals will have word limits. So this might influence how long your manuscript is and what you need to trim back. Remember, most journals have the option to allow for supplemental material. So this means even if there's a limit to the number of tables or figures you might be allowed to publish with your manuscript, there is often an option for supplementary material to provide additional data sets, additional tables, additional figures that you can reference in your manuscript. So be cognizant and be respectful of any word limits or table and figure limits, but do know that there are options and ways to make sure all of your data and your explanations are included appropriately. So let's go through a couple of great examples that we've pulled out to highlight today. So this article does a really great job of thinking about the flow of qualitative research, presenting that qualitative data by main themes picked up from interviews and focus groups. So this is a nice way to structure qualitative data. You can see how there's these key pieces pulled out and highlighted within the manuscript. This is another great table to summarize participants for clarity and transparency. Excuse me. So you can take a look at how the tables can still be used in qualitative research. A common method of utilizing interview data is to embed responses into the text to get the point across. So this is useful for clearly showing the point and respecting the words of the participants. So pulling out those direct quotes, and this is a great example of that. So you can really weave in those direct quotes as well as your own summary and interpretation of data, but honoring the raw data in that sense is still very important when you're presenting that in your manuscript. It's important as well to think about the repositories. So even after you're going through and organizing all of your data, presenting it, you'll want to think about where this is stored. So going back to that main question, how it should be accessed, where are you sharing it, what data is being shared. You'll want to think about discipline-specific and community-recognized repositories where possible, or even general repositories if no suitable community resource is available. Your institution is a really great resource to tap into for ideas. Some institutions will have repositories as well where you can deposit your data. Figshare is another tool as well. You have fair sharing and the re3data.org that you can also search for a suitable repository. When you go to submit your manuscript, it's important to provide a URL link to your research data in your manuscript file under the heading Data Accessibility Statement. So that URL will be added to your article on publication. It's important, again, for that transparency, the ability to reproduce or try to reproduce your data in that study is really important to advance science. So these data files will not be checked for accuracy, copy edited, typeset, or proofread unless you're actually, unless it's like, you're looking at the table or figure within the manuscript itself. So, but the actual data files themselves will not be going through that peer review process, especially if it was uploaded to a repository. So just some things to consider and think about as you are working on your data collection and putting together the data management plan and working with your authors and your co-authors on, how are we storing this, when, where, who can access it, how, why, all the big questions. So.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about SAGE's policy. Some journals require that data or code is shared with the journal for replication confirmation, and this is usually related to quantitative data. It's becoming more common for journals, but it's certainly not universal. Sharing data increases transparency and it enhances replication confirmation. Individual SAGE journals have different policies about data sharing, but most support, expect, or require data sharing. It's important that you look at the individual submission guidelines for the journal you're submitting to, so you follow the appropriate policy. And of course, keep track of your funders' requirements so you're compliant with their policies as well. So as you develop your manuscript and you conduct research, keep in mind the importance of authorship, etiquette, and collaboration. Our next How to Get Published webinar will occur on April 26th on this topic, where we discuss the etiquette of collaborative writing and provide you with practical tools to ensure a smooth writing process. We encourage you to go back and watch recordings of other topics we've covered in the series, including how to write and format a manuscript, how to navigate the peer review process. In addition, register for an upcoming webinar on topics like authorship, image integrity, and securing funding. Should you have any questions or need support along your journal as an author, the Sage Author Gateway is Sage's dedicated space for author support and services. Visit the website for more resources, tips, and tricks while writing, support through the production process, and help in publicizing your author after it's published. Information about our author rights and reuse policy is easily discoverable for reference. And last but not least, we also have a Chinese author gateway that features translated materials on the topic. Sage takes its role as a partner to authors through the publishing process very seriously. Hopefully this workshop has been helpful. But if you need additional guidance as a refresher, we have many resources on our website. The Sage Campus platform offers a course on how to get published. We also have a 3-part video series with some great tips and tricks we've covered today. Plus, we have a handy PDF guide you can reference and easily share with colleagues. And with that, I'm happy to pass this off to our guest panelist, Erin Barron, for her tips and tricks on the topic.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here, and that was wonderful, and I learned a lot as well. I have some very straightforward tips for organizing and presenting data. The most important thing that I have found, both as a researcher, as an author, and as an editor and a reviewer, is that it is important to keep it simple. So to make sure that the way you organize is simple, so that really anybody who goes to your data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, knows what they're looking at when it's organized. It also helps to keep it simple, so when it's organized, if it's been a while and you have to go back to the data, it doesn't take you a while to orient to the data. You can easily go back to the data and know exactly what you're looking at, and also know what you're looking for, and easily find what you're looking for. So keeping it simple. And sometimes that means having like multiple different spreadsheets. Sometimes that means having one large spreadsheet, or sometimes that means having data in multiple different places with really clear headers, or sometimes it means having it kind of all in one place so that it's easily searchable. As far as presenting your data, again, keeping it simple is probably the most important feedback that I've given to authors over the years as an editor and as a reviewer. Keep it simple, keep it clear. And by keeping it clear, I mean making sure that you are using simple and consistent fonts. If it's in a table or if it's a figure, making sure that your fonts are consistent, because you don't want people attending to what the font is. You want the words to be what they're looking at, not how the font looks. You want the data that are in the table or the data that are in the figure to tell a really clear story. You don't want the reader to have to look at the heading and maybe to have to look at the notes multiple times. You want the figure to very clearly tell a story. And that means that you might have to break it up into multiple figures, or it means that you might need to simplify your figure. If you find that you're wanting to have a really long note or lots of labels or text boxes around the figure, then it's probably too complicated. You want to make sure that you have as few, like very simple headers, very simple notes, maybe notes that just, explain any acronyms or explain any markers that are in the figure. But you don't want the note to be too extensive, because then all it is a text box, really. And so if you're using a figure, it should tell a really clear story. You want to keep your headers simple, as I said. So the header shouldn't be a really long sentence. The header should just be really simple, what the reader is expecting to find in that figure and in that table. And the tables and the figures should go beyond what's in the text. So it should provide additional information. If it's all in the text, then you don't need a table. Or if it's all in the table, you certainly don't need it also elaborated in the text. So there should be, there can be like some simple redundancies just to help like orient readers, but it should not be complete overlap. There should not be too many redundancies in the table and in the figures. And then everything should be consistent. So make sure, read and reread, have people, I always find it helpful to have people who are not involved in the study, weren't involved in the research, weren't involved in the manuscript, review for consistency across tables and figures. Especially when you're reporting qualitative data, make sure that the voice is the same, that you're using the same voice and tone in the tables and the figures and the text. But that's true for all forms of data and all types, all methodologies. And then particularly with tables and figures, to make sure that somebody who's not embedded in the study, not embedded in the data, reviews it for you and asks and if they have questions, they let you know what the questions are so that you can make sure that the figure and tables are clear. I know that this isn't always true, particularly with meta-analyses, but tables, try to keep them to one page. If it goes beyond one page, then it's really just a really long list, right? And I know for meta-analyses and systematic literature reviews in particular, sometimes it's hard, but there are many great examples out there of single one-page papers that have one-page tables, that have the list of the articles and then the relevant information in the columns. And the same for figures. If the figure extends beyond multiple pages, it's not going to be useful to the reader. So make sure that it's simple, it's able to be analyzed quickly and on one page, and that it tells a really clear story that extends what's in the manuscript. That, I think, is beyond being simple, that is probably the most important thing to think about when adding tables and figures. Is this necessary for extending what the story that I'm telling in the text? And then the final tip I have is to, in a table or a figure, to if you have multiple types of information, you can combine it, and sometimes those tables can be really helpful for analyzing things, synthesizing data together. Like if you're for instance looking at two different in a quantitative study, if you're looking at two different dependent variables, and maybe you're able to show the relationship over time as well as the relationship between the variables, that can be really important in a table. But if they're not meaningful, don't include them together just to save space. And I've seen that done in some papers where It's like they throw everything together on a table because they have the room and the table, but they're not actually related to each other and they're not meaningful together. Then it doesn't make sense to put them together. Keep them separate and have, two separate tables and figures. Those are my tips.
Thank you, Erin. No, that's fantastic and a great addition to what we've already covered. And there's a lot of great questions that have come in here today. And I know some of those have been answered by all of us, but I'm really excited to dive into some of these questions today. So Maria, if it's okay, I'd love to start that off.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, everyone, for sending in your questions and keep sending them. We'll try to answer as many as we can today. So I will start with this question here. If we share the data, some people might abuse and unethically publish an article with it. What can they do? What can the researcher do to avoid that problem?
So I can jump in here. There's some of that with that data management plan and understanding what are the restrictions. So when you're outlining where you're uploading your data, are you uploading it to a repository? Are you uploading it to, and what are the licenses associated with that? A lot of times that data is uploaded to a repository and you have maybe a CC BY license. So it does allow for reuse, but it would require to have that disclosure, the credit. So just like when you are citing other people's research, you should be citing other people's data as well. So building upon what's already out there, but giving credit where credit is due. Really, it's just like with publishing your research, you're just going to want to make sure that you're disclosing any parties that you may have incorporated into your manuscript or into your data, and making sure you have secured that you as an author have secured those appropriate permissions and disclosing that. And then also understanding where you're uploading your data and what those reuse policies are for those repositories. And then we as authors, we as researchers just have to do our own due diligence and understand what data we are using and how, and do we have those permissions to reuse that? And if we don't, being able to secure that. So it's one of your responsibilities as an author, as a researcher, to make sure that you are securing the appropriate permissions and looking into those nuances. So Sage has an author reuse policy on how you can reuse your own research and your own data in future publications, but also different policies on what may not require permission, if something's in public domain, if something has what we call like a fair reuse, but that's very nuanced and can be very daunting to navigate those type of permissions. We can circulate some links as well following this webinar because it's a great conversation. So we just have to trust that us as researchers, us as authors are doing our own due diligence, and people make mistakes. We're all human. Hopefully if someone left something out or used a data set in a certain way, it's as simple as they just didn't realize, and hopefully that can be corrected, and just either through a core addendum, an erratum, updating the version of record to make sure that credit is given where credit is due. And we encourage you, if you do notice something that has gone awry or something that doesn't look right, maybe someone had reused your data, it didn't look like they had given credit, I encourage you to reach out to the publisher, to your institution, to investigate so that we can help navigate that situation. Erin or Sean, is there anything that you want to add to that conversation?
No, I just would say that it does, I think that having people use your data, as long as they cite you, I think that's actually wonderful. Of course, if they're using your data and not citing you and misusing your data, that's problematic. But getting to a place in science where people are taking our data and using it and analyzing it in different ways can really move the field forward. So there is kind of the flip side to that, which can be exciting for science.
Thank you. That's a very good point. There is a question here, well, a few questions about if there is an ideal number of tables or figures to use in a manuscript. What would you say is the ideal?
I would, well, the first, sorry, Erin, I don't know if you want to chime in. My first thing is look at the journal guidelines, the author submission guidelines. If you have a journal in mind, that will be the best guide. A lot of journals will have table and figure limits, so maybe no more than 5 allowed per manuscript. It really varies by journal. Do not take that number as the end all be all. And then you can always include something as supplemental material. If you don't have a journal in mind yet, I would say, Erin, you might be better to speak to this. Just focus on how you need to present the data, what data you need to present, what is most crucial to your manuscript and the findings, and that analysis, results, discussion. And then once you decide on that journal, you can tailor it down from there. Sorry, Erin, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, that was good. Yeah, no, that I'm glad you said that first. And I think that there's truly no way to answer that beyond like author guidelines, because it really is about what is needed for your manuscript to make sure that the story is told, the complete, story that you want to tell is told. And certain data will lend themselves to tables and figures better. So, it just depends on what data are in your study and what data are the data that you want to present. I think it's rare for there to be a manuscript with none, unless it's like a conceptual piece, but even those are usually there's a figure or something that helps convey the message. So I do think it's really important to have some, because they provide the reader with an easy way to consume the information, and too many can be distracting. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the next question. If we want our data to be available, for example, for a meta-analysis with individual data, is there any repository or option with Sage to store the information?
I can answer this one. Yes, you can publish this as supplemental material. So when you upload it through the ScholarOne SageTrack platform, you can upload it as supplemental material, and that will be hosted on Figshare. So that is a repository as well, and that the information can be stored there. Great question. Actually, if I could take the next one, there was a question that came in about the age of the data. And I know this has come up in previous webinars, so I wanted to actually address this live because we have a time. I lost the question specifically, but the question was around, at what point is the data too old, or might it not be relevant in the manuscript as much anymore? Well, we will say generally the age of the data set is very important. So if too much time has passed, this can hurt the ability to generalize findings. But if the data is only a few years old, I would encourage you to submit a paper or work on those. But ultimately, knowing what other literature is out there and understanding what your discipline has been doing in terms of developing and advancing would also be relevant. So sometimes having older data is not necessarily a bad thing, but you do want to be mindful that it could be, I don't want to say it depends, but it does depend a little bit there. And especially what it's being used for, is it secondary data, like we talked about, that you're using to build upon something from historical findings? So a little bit that depends. Erin or Sean, is there anything you want to add there?
That was sufficient for sure. That's what I would have said. Yeah.
There was a question here about, well, a few questions actually about presenting mixed methods data and what's the best way to present it. Would you have any advice for researchers?
Erin, do you want to start, or I can start, either one?
I mean, I think one of the most exciting things about mixed methods research is the data integration. So the best way I would say is to tell the data in a way that shows your story. And so sometimes that's going to mean showing the data in two different figures and two different tables, maybe the primary sources from each methodology. But then, showing clear integration of the data is why we do mixed methods, right? And so I think that, to me, without being an expert in mixed methodologies, to me, that's what I would want to see as a reader. I think that's the purpose, right, of mixed methods data, is to show that we've done, we've integrated these methodologies. And so in a figure or a table, showing that integration is very important.
Agreed. If I could take the next one, we had talked a little bit about, I saw a note on should negative or no results go to an appendix. We did talk a little bit about negative and null findings. No, those should not go in an appendix, and that should be included within your manuscript itself, whether, that will come in your results, your discussions, your conclusions, potentially any limitations or future studies that need to be conducted. But no, those should go in the main body of the manuscript. Or Erin or Sean, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Sorry, I keep muting myself and then getting excited and forgetting to unmute. No, those data are really important, right? So we have a pretty serious file drawer issue still in science. And so the negative results, or even just non-results, non-effects, are really important data. And they are as important as data where we have a significant finding. So I don't think it should be a practice to make those secondary at all. I think we need to present those along with the other data.
Agreed. Sean, sorry.
I was going to say, thank you both. You definitely covered it very well. And I was going to dive into the next question. So someone asked, could I share a synthetic dummy data with the same distribution and variables of the real data? Is there any regulation or legal issue about doing this?
That's a great question, and one that we will follow up on. We would need to get a little bit more context, I think, on the background of that. So we'll follow up with you separately on that one.
I have a question here about sharing data. So sometimes one of the promises researchers make to participants is that the collected data would only be used for the purposes of the current study. Won't sharing the data be a breach of that promise? Isn't it unethical?
I would say here, follow your institutional review board guidelines, or the Equator Network, your organization's guidelines in understanding what can and cannot be shared. And then also when you're working on that data management plan, for the grant funder, maybe there's some restrictions there. Respecting that, maybe you need to anonymize the data, or in the way that you're presenting it and sharing it. So there might be some restrictions, and you may not be able to upload that to a certain repository publicly. Erin or Sean, I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add there.
Yeah, I would just say follow your IRB guidelines.
I can take the next one. We covered a lot of metadata conversations in this webinar today. And there were tips on, people were asking for tips on how much metadata in a research paper should be included. And that's a really great question. So number one would be following the guidelines of the target journal or the conference. Different publications have different requirements for metadata. Some journals may only require a minimal amount of metadata, while others may require a detailed description. So make sure to read those guidelines carefully and follow them. Definitely include the essential metadata. So at minimum, your paper should include the title, the author names, affiliation, abstract, keywords, references. These are essential pieces of metadata that help readers understand the scope and purpose of your research. And that ties into your metadata of your data as well, even if you're uploading it to the repository. So there may be additional metadata like funding information, ethics approval, that data availability that we talked about, conflict of interest statements. So that establishes the credibility and transparency of your research. And then keeping it concise and relevant. So Erin, I know you talked about this in your tips. So you really want to make sure that while it's important to provide enough metadata to enable readers to understand and replicate your research, it's equally important to avoid overloading them with unnecessary information. So keep your metadata concise and relevant to the scope and purpose of your research in the data that you're sharing. And then, as we talked about, as Erin talked about, and we talked about in this presentation, the metadata, same thing. Make sure you're using appropriate headings and subheadings to organize your metadata, and make sure that any abbreviations or acronyms are clearly explained clearly. So this really depends on the scientific requirements of the publication and the subject matter of the research. But there's really great guidelines that you'll find from a repository that you might be uploading your data to, as well as the journal to which you're submitting. Erin or Sean, is there anything that you wanted to add on the amount of metadata?
Nothing for me. I think you've covered it all.
I think we might have time for one more question. And I wanted to quickly cover this one because it's quick. We only have 2 minutes left. There was a question on, when citing participants, do you recommend using names after changing them, or participant numbers, and how that should be outlined? This really depends on the journal. So we say this all the time, but check the manuscript submission guidelines. There's really not a one-size-fits-all answer to this question. The most common method for citing participants in qualitative data analysis can vary depending on the discipline, the specific research project, and any ethical considerations. So there's not a one-size-fits-all answer here. Using pseudonyms is a common approach in many qualitative research studies. So this approach allows researchers to protect the privacy and confidentiality of their participants, while still allowing them to refer to specific individuals through their analysis. But the choice of method should be guided by the specific context and goals of the research project. So it's important to carefully consider the ethical implications of different approaches and follow established ethical guidelines and best practices. So wanted to quickly chime in with that in the last minute.
Thank you, Jessica. I think we have run out of time now. So thank you so much for all your questions. We will follow up with you individually to answer those questions, but we have a lot of other resources on our website. We're going to send an email to everyone who attended with the slides and the recording and any additional information that we can include. So look out for that. And again, thank you so much for coming, and thank you to all our speakers today for a really great presentation. And we hope to see you next month.